The sky above Valtherus Prime burned with the light of dying ships, and High Arbiter Thyssen watched it all with 4 eyes that had grown dim with despair. He stood in the command center of the hegemony's last stronghold, surrounded by screens that showed nothing but death and destruction. And he knew in his ancient heart that this was the end of everything his people had built over 10,000 years. The Dread Swarm had come. They were not a species in any way that the 12 races of the Corvani hegemony understood the word, for they were a hunger-given form, a collective mind spread across millions of bioships that existed only to consume and spread and consume again. For 300 years, the hegemony had watched the swarm devour the outer rim of the galaxy, always believing that their fleets and their shields and their carefully written rules of warfare would protect them when the darkness finally reached their borders. They had been wrong. High Arbiter called Admiral Vex, a crystalline body flickering with stress patterns that Thyssen had never seen in his 2 centuries of service. The outer defense grid has fallen, and we have lost contact with the 3rd and 5th fleets. Thyssen turned one pair of eyes toward the tactical display while keeping the other pair fixed on the viewport, where he could see the swarm's living ships pressing against the planetary shields, like parasites trying to burrow into healthy flesh. How long until the shields fail? He asked, though he already knew the answer would bring no comfort. 6 hours, Admiral Vex replied. Perhaps 7, if we divert all remaining power from the civilian sectors. 3 billion Corvani lived on Valtherus Prime, and they huddled now in underground shelters, praying to gods that had never answered and hoping that somehow their leaders would find a way to save them. But Thyssen had no miracles to offer the hegemony's great fleet. Those beautiful crystalline vessels that had kept peace among 12 species for generations now drifted as shattered debris in the space above their world, and the few ships that remained were too damaged to fight and too slow to flee. We followed every protocol, Vex said, and her voice carried a bitterness that surprised Thyssen. We fought with honor and precision and restraint, just as the Accords demanded, and the swarm simply ignored our rules and overwhelmed yours with numbers we could not match. Thyssen said nothing because there was nothing to say. The swarm did not negotiate, did not accept surrender, did not recognize the carefully written laws that governed civilized warfare among the stars. And trying to fight them with honor was like trying to reason with a hurricane. There is one option, said a quiet voice from the back of the room. Thyssen turned all 4 eyes toward Counselor Myra, a small female from the Veeth species, whose people were known for their caution and their long memories. Speak, Thyssen commanded. Myra stepped forward, her gray skin pale with fear, and placed a data crystal on the central console. 40 years ago, when the humans first made contact with the hegemony, this council debated their fate for 6 standard months, she said. And during that debate, 17 species voted for what we called preemptive neutralization, because they believed humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to spread among the stars. I remember, Thyssen said. I was among those who argued for mercy. Yes, Myra agreed. And mercy won by only 3 votes, so we quarantined them instead, placed warning beacons around their territory, restricted their travel, monitored their colonies, and treated them like dangerous animals that might one day need to be put down. Admiral Vex made a sound of disgust. You want us to call the humans for help? She demanded. The same humans we have insulted and controlled and feared for 4 decades. I want us to survive, Myra replied simply. And the humans are the only species that has ever made the swarm retreat. The room fell silent. Thyssen had heard the reports. Of course, for every species in the hegemony had heard them, though few wanted to believe them. 7 years ago, a swarm scouting force had entered human space and attacked one of their outer colonies, expecting easy prey, as they had found among so many other young species. What happened next had been classified at the highest levels. And even now, Thiessen only knew fragments of the truth. The humans had not called for help from the hegemony. They had not evacuated their people or negotiated for time. They had simply fought back with a ferocity that shocked even the Kreth warrior caste, and when the battle was over, the swarm's scouting force had been completely destroyed. Not defeated, not driven back, destroyed, down to the last bioship, with human vessels pursuing fleeing enemies across 3 star systems to ensure that nothing survived to report what it had encountered. The humans frightened me, Thiessen admitted. Their lives are so short, barely a century, and yet they fill those brief years with more violence and passion than species 10 times their age. And I do not understand how they think or what they truly want. They frighten everyone, Myra said. But right now, High Arbiter, I am more frightened of the swarm. Thiessen looked at the screens again. He watched another hegemony ship explode in silence, its crew of 2,000 dying in an instant. And he thought of the 3 billion civilians beneath his feet who would share that fate in a matter of hours. He thought of his own children, safe on a distant colony, who would grow up without a father if he died here. He thought of 10,000 years of civilization about to be consumed by mindless hunger. Send the message, he said at last. Tell the humans that the Corvani hegemony requests immediate military assistance. And tell them, he paused, searching for words that did not come easily. Tell them that we will be grateful for any aid they choose to provide. The message was sent. It traveled across the vast emptiness of space at speeds that bent the laws of physics, crossing quarantine zones and warning beacons and all the barriers the hegemony had built to keep humanity contained. And, in the cold darkness beyond those barriers, someone received it. High Arbiter Thiessen returned his gaze to the burning sky above his world. He had done something that no leader of the hegemony had ever done before, and he had no idea what would answer his call. But as he watched the swarm pressing against his dying shields, he found that he no longer cared what came, as long as something did. Valtherus Prime waited for salvation. And in the distance, something ancient and terrible began to stir. The swarm had begun its final assault when the sensors screamed. Admiral Vex was the first to notice, her crystalline body flashing with alarm patterns as she stared at her tactical display in disbelief. High Arbiter, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 12 unknown contacts have just dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Thiessen turned all 4 eyes toward the main screen. Where? He demanded. Inside the swarm formation, Vex replied. Directly inside, surrounded by enemy vessels on all sides. The command center erupted in confused chatter. What Vex was describing was impossible. Every species in the galaxy knew that you could not exit faster-than-light travel inside an enemy formation, for the gravitational interference alone would tear your ship apart, and even if you survived the transition, you would be surrounded and destroyed before you could raise shields. They're not destroyed, a sensor officer called out. They're firing. Thiessen watched the display as 12 black shapes appeared among the organic mass of the swarm's fleet. He watched them open fire, and he felt his blood turn cold. The human ships did not fight like any vessel he had ever seen. They did not form defensive lines or maintain safe distances or coordinate their attacks through careful communication, for instead, they simply attacked with a brutality that made the swarm itself look gentle. Bright lances of energy cut through swarm bioships like blades through soft flesh. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to impossible speeds, punched clean through enemy hulls, and continued into the ships beyond. One human vessel deployed something that looked like a small sun, a ball of concentrated plasma that expanded outward and burned a dozen swarm ships to ash in seconds. What am I watching? Vex breathed. Humans, Thiessen replied. You are watching humans fight without restraint. The swarm tried to respond. Millions of years of collective instinct drove it to swarm the new threats, to surround them with numbers and crush them beneath the weight of flesh and fury. But the human ships moved like nothing the swarm had ever encountered. They did not hold position and fight, for they swept through the enemy formation in complex patterns that seemed random, but somehow left destruction in their wake at every turn. They used the swarm's own numbers against it, drawing clusters of bioships into kill zones where waiting weapons reduced them to vapor. One ship, slightly larger than the others, simply accelerated toward a swarm carrier that dwarfed it by a factor of 10 and rammed straight through the organic hull. Thyssen watched the human vessel emerge from the other side of the carrier, trailing gore and debris, and continue fighting as if nothing had happened. That should have destroyed them, Vex said, her voice shaking. The impact alone should have killed every being on that ship, and yet they live. Thyssen replied he noticed something else then, something that disturbed him more than the weapons or the tactics. The human ships were broadcasting on open channels, and Thyssen could hear voices coming through the communication systems. They were laughing, not the nervous laughter of terrified soldiers trying to maintain courage, but genuine amusement, as if the battle against the most feared enemy in the galaxy was entertainment. Target the cluster at bearing 77. Let's see how they like the new toys, one voice said. Already on it. Watch this, another replied. An explosion bloomed in the swarm formation, larger than anything Thyssen had seen before. And the second voice came back with obvious satisfaction. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I love my job. Counselor Myra had joined Thyssen at the main display, her gray skin almost white with shock. They are enjoying this, she said. They are actually enjoying this. Yes, Thyssen agreed. And that is why we quarantined them. Because we saw what they could do, and we were afraid of what would happen if they ever had a reason to use it. The battle continued for 6 hours, 6 hours of destruction on a scale that the Kolvani hegemony had never witnessed. The swarm threw everything it had at the 12 human ships, sending wave after wave of bioships to overwhelm them. And every wave was broken. Human weapons tore through organic hulls without mercy. Human pilots performed maneuvers that should have been impossible, pushing their ships to limits that no sane species would consider. Human soldiers boarded damaged swarm vessels and fought through corridors filled with alien horrors, emerging covered in gore and immediately moving to the next target. And through it all, the humans kept laughing. They joked on open channels about which gunner had the highest kill count. They complained that the swarm was not putting up enough of a fight. They played music, strange rhythmic human music, loud enough that the swarm's collective consciousness could hear it. And somehow that music felt more threatening than the weapons by the time the last swarm ship fled. The humans had lost nothing. Not a single one of their 12 vessels had been destroyed. Several showed damage. Yes, but they continued to function and fight with a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. The shields of Valthor's Prime flickered one final time and then stabilized as the swarm's assault ended. 3 billion Korvani, who had been waiting to die, suddenly found themselves alive. Admiral Vex collapsed into her chair, her crystalline body dimming with exhaustion, and stared at the display that now showed empty space where an enemy fleet had been. They saved us, she said, her voice hollow. The humans saved us. They did more than save us, Thyssen replied quietly. He was watching the 12 black ships regroup and orient themselves toward the direction the swarm had fled. He was watching predators that had just finished with one hunt and were already eager for the next. They reminded the galaxy of something we had forgotten, he continued. Something we should never have forgotten. Counselor Myra looked at him with fear in her eyes. What is that, High Arbiter? Thyssen watched the human fleet begin to move, watched them accelerate toward the fleeing swarm with obvious intent, and he felt a cold certainty settle into his heart. that there are worse things in the universe than the swarm, he said. And we just invited one of them into our home. The Black Fleet vanished into faster-than-light travel, pursuing their broken enemy across the stars and on Vulturus Prime. 3 billion survivors began to realize that their salvation had come with a price they were only beginning to understand. Admiral Helena Vance was dreaming of her daughter's wedding when the emergency alert dragged her back to consciousness. She sat up in the darkness of her quarters, heart pounding, and reached for the communicator that flashed red on her knit stand. "Report," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Ma'am, we've received a priority transmission from Kovani Space," came the reply from her aide. "Lieutenant Park, you're going to want to see this yourself." 20 minutes later, Vance stood in the secure communications room at United Earth Command, reading the message for the third time while a growing crowd of officers gathered behind her. The Kovani hegemony, those arrogant bastards who had spent 40 years treating humanity like rabid dogs, were begging for help. "Well," said General Morrison, a heavy-set man with gray hair and a face carved from decades of hard decisions. "I never thought I'd see the day. The swarm is at their capital," Vance said. 3 billion civilians, their entire government, and what's left of their fleet, all about to be consumed. "And they want us to save them," Morrison replied. "The same people who voted to exterminate our species before we even left our home system." Vance set down the datapad and looked around the room at the faces of Earth's military leadership. She saw anger in some of those faces, and she understood it, for she had been there 40 years ago when humanity first reached out to the stars with hope and wonder, only to be greeted with fear and contempt. She had watched the hegemony place warning beacons around human space, as if they were marking a contaminated zone. She had read the classified reports of their council debates, where species she had never met argued about whether to destroy Earth before humanity could become a threat. She had every reason to let the Kovani burn. "I'm going to ask a simple question," Vance said, "and I want honest answers, not what you think I want to hear." The room fell silent. Are we the kind of species that lets 3 billion people die because their leaders were afraid of us? Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then General Morrison sighed and shook his head. "No," he admitted. "We're not, and I hate that about us sometimes." "Good," Vance said, "because I was going to order the response anyway, and I'd rather have your support than your resentment." She turned to Lieutenant Park. "Wake up Admiral Chung and tell him the Black Fleet is active," she said. "Full deployment, no restrictions, weapons free upon arrival." Park's face went pale. "Ma'am, the Black Fleet is officially decommissioned," he said. "It doesn't exist." "Then I guess we're sending ghosts to save the Kovani," Vance replied. "Now move." The Black Fleet did not appear in any official record. Its 12 ships had no names, only numbers, and their hulls were painted in a material that absorbed light so completely that they looked like wounds cut into the fabric of space itself. The crews were volunteers, men and women who had signed away their identities and accepted that they would never be acknowledged. For what they did, they trained in secret facilities beyond the edge of known space. They carried weapons that the Galactic Accords had banned, weapons that humanity had publicly destroyed but secretly perfected, because Earth had learned long ago that the universe did not reward those who played by the rules. Commander Marcus Cole stood on the bridge of Black 7 and watched his crew prepare for departure. He was 43 years old, with gray beginning to touch his temples and scars on his hands from battles that had never officially happened. He had killed enemies that humanity was not supposed to know existed, and he had done it without hesitation or regret. Orders received, his communications officer reported. "We are to proceed to Kovani space at maximum speed and engage the swarm with extreme prejudice." "Any restrictions?" Cole asked. "None, sir," the officer replied. and there was something like excitement in her voice. "Admiral Vance says we are to use our own judgment and do whatever is necessary." Cole allowed himself a small smile. The hegemony had spent decades lecturing humanity about proportional response and civilized warfare and the importance of restraint. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. "Signal all ships," Cole said. "We jump in 5 minutes, and I want everyone to understand something before we go." He paused, looking around at the faces of his crew, people who had given up normal lives to serve in a fleet that did not exist. "The galaxy thinks they know what humans are," he continued. "They think we're primitive and violent and barely civilized. And they're not entirely wrong about that. But they've only seen us when we were holding back." He stood straighter, and his voice hardened. "Today, we stop holding back. And we show every species watching what happens when you threaten people under human protection. So when we arrive at Valkyris Prime, I want the swarm destroyed. I want the civilians saved. And I want every alien in that system to understand that they never, ever want to see us coming for them." The crew responded with silence that spoke louder than cheers. They knew what they were. They knew what they could do. They had been waiting a very long time for permission to do it. The Black Fleet departed Earth space without fanfare or ceremony. 12 ships slipped into faster-than-light travel simultaneously, leaving behind only a brief distortion in the fabric of space and a single encoded message to Admiral Vance. The message contained only 2 words: "They're coming," across the galaxy. The Kovani hegemony continued to die. Unaware that help was on the way, High Arbiter Beeson stood in his command center and watched the shields flicker and fail in sections, watched more of his ships explode, watched the swarm press ever closer to his world. He had sent his message to the humans hours ago and received no response. Part of him wondered if they would come at all. Part of him wondered if they would simply watch from the safety of their quarantine zone while the hegemony burned. A fitting revenge for decades of insults and restrictions. But deep in his hearts, in the place where instinct lived, Thiessen felt something he could not explain. He felt like prey that had just heard a predator's footstep in the darkness. He felt like the balance of the universe was about to shift, and he felt, for the first time in hours, something that might have been hope. The Black Fleet was coming, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. The swarm had never known fear before the humans came. For millions of years, it had spread across the galaxy, consuming species after species, growing stronger with each world it devoured. And nothing had ever made it hesitate. It did not negotiate because negotiation required understanding. And the swarm only understood hunger. It did not retreat because retreat required accepting that something was stronger. And nothing had ever been stronger than the endless tide of bioships and drones and consuming flesh. But now the swarm was running, and something was chasing it, and for the first time in its ancient existence, the collective consciousness felt something that might have been terror. The Black Fleet pursued without mercy. Commander Cole stood on the bridge of Black 7 and watched the fleeing swarm bioships scatter across 3 star systems like insects trying to escape a fire. Let any of them reach the deep void, he ordered. The swarm communicates through its collective consciousness, and every ship that escapes is a ship that can warn the rest of the hive about what they've encountered. His crew responded with the efficiency of soldiers who had trained for this moment. Their entire careers, human ships broke formation and hunted in pairs, running down fleeing bioships and destroying them before they could jump to safety. Some swarm vessels tried to fight back, turning to face their pursuers with the desperate courage of the doomed, and they were destroyed in seconds. Others tried to hide in the shadows of asteroids and moons, and human sensors found them anyway. Captain, his tactical officer reported, we've tracked the main swarm fleet to the Narration system, and long-range scans show something interesting. Cole moved to the display and felt a smile spread across his face. Is that what I think it is? He asked. Yes, sir, the officer replied. A mobile hive core, approximately the size of a small moon. Organic structure, heavily defended. And our analysis suggests it's the central processing node for this entire swarm faction. The hive core was a legend among the species of the galaxy. Some called it the swarm's brain. Others called it their heart. But everyone agreed that no one had ever found one because the swarm protected its cores with fanatical devotion. The Corvani hegemony had searched for centuries without success. The humans had found one in less than a day. Signal all ships, Cole said. We're going in. What followed would be studied by military analysts across the galaxy for generations. And most of them would need psychological treatment afterward. The Black Fleet did not simply attack the hive core from a safe distance. For instead, they fought their way through the defensive fleet with brutal efficiency and then did something that no sane species would ever consider. They boarded it. Dropships launched from human vessels and crashed through the organic membrane of the hive core, disgorging squads of soldiers in heavy armor who advanced into the living structure with weapons blazing. The footage from their helmet cameras would later be classified, then declassified, then classified again, because watching it caused nightmares in viewers who had never experienced combat. Human soldiers moved through writhing corridors of flesh and bone, killing swarm drones by the hundreds, advancing steadily toward the core's central chamber. They did not hesitate when faced with horrors that had driven other species mad, for they simply raised their weapons and fired and kept moving. Sergeant Chun, what's your status? Commander Cole asked over the communication channel. We're having a great time, sir, came the reply, accompanied by the sound of gunfire and something screaming. These tunnels are disgusting, but the resistance is lighter than expected. I think we really hurt them at Valtherus. Don't get overconfident, Cole warned, with respect. Sir, I'm not overconfident, Chun replied. I'm just disappointed. I was hoping for more of a challenge. Laughter echoed through the communication channel, and Cole shook his head. His soldiers were insane by the standards of every other species in the galaxy, but they were his kind of insane. The assault teams reached the central chamber of the hive core after 4 hours of continuous fighting. What they found there would change everything. The swarm's collective consciousness was not just an instinct or a shared hunger, for it was an actual intelligence, ancient and vast and terrible, and it kept records. Human technicians worked frantically to download data from the organic computers, while soldiers held off waves of increasingly desperate swarm defenders. What they found in that data was a history of the galaxy written in blood and consumption. They found records of thousands of species that the swarm had devoured over millions of years. They found tactical analyses of every major civilization currently in existence, and they found something else, something that made Commander Cole's blood run cold, even as it filled him with a strange pride. They found the swarm's assessment of humanity. The swarm had been watching humans since first contact, studying them from a distance, trying to understand what made them different from every other species it had encountered. The swarm was afraid not of human weapons, for the swarm had faced powerful weapons before, not of human tactics, for the swarm had adapted to countless strategies over its existence. The swarm was afraid because it had recognized something in humanity that it had never seen in any other species, a hunger that matched its own. The swarm existed to consume, to grow, to spread, and it had always believed that this made it unique in the universe. But humans had the same drive, expressed in different ways. And the swarm's collective consciousness had calculated that a direct conflict with humanity would not end in victory, it would end in mutual destruction. Or worse, and human victory, because humans had something the swarm did not have. Humans could change. They could adapt not just their tactics, but their very nature, pushing themselves beyond any limit, breaking any rule, becoming whatever they needed to become to survive. The swarm had a name for them in its ancient language, a designation it had never given to any other species, the Endless Ones, because no matter how many humans the swarm killed, more would come, and they would come angrier and more dangerous than before, and they would never, ever stop until their enemy was completely destroyed. "Sir," Sergeant Chen reported, "charges are set. We're ready for extraction." Commander Cole looked at the data one more time, at the ancient consciousness that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years and had finally encountered something it could not consume. "All teams withdraw," he ordered. "We're done here." The human soldiers retreated to their dropships, fighting their way back through corridors that were now filled with the dying spasms of a wounded god. They escaped into space moments before the charges detonated. The hive core died in a flash of nuclear fire, its consciousness scattered across the void. And the swarm felt something new. The swarm felt despair and across the galaxy, watching through sensors and satellites and stolen feeds. Every other species felt something too. They felt the birth of a new fear, one that would shape the future of galactic civilization for centuries to come, the fear of humanity unleashed. The Black Fleet returned to Vulturus Prime 7 days after their departure, and the world that greeted them was very different from the one they had left behind. High Arbiter Thiessen had ordered the construction of a great stage in the central plaza of the capital city, and millions of Corvani had gathered to witness the ceremony that would honor their saviors. Banners flew in colors that represented all 12 species of the hegemony. Musicians prepared to play songs of gratitude, and celebration. Medals had been forged in precious metals, and speeches had been written that spoke of eternal friendship between humans and the civilized races of the galaxy. But when the human dropship landed and its doors opened, Thiessen felt all of his carefully planned words die in his throat. The woman who stepped out was not what he had expected. Colonel Yuki Tanaka was small by human standards, barely reaching Thiessen's shoulder, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style and eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. She wore armor that still showed the burns and scars of recent combat. She did not smile. Behind her came a squad of human soldiers, each one bearing the marks of battle, and they moved with a confidence that made the gathered crowd fall silent. "High Arbiter Thiessen," Colonel Tanaka said, her voice carrying across the plaza without any apparent effort. "I am here to report that the swarm threat to your system has been eliminated." Thiessen stepped forward, spreading his arms in the traditional gesture of welcome. "Colonel Tanaka, on behalf of the Corvani hegemony and all 12 of our member species, I thank you for your heroic—" "I'm going to stop you there," Tanaka interrupted. The plaza fell completely silent. "We didn't come here for your thanks," Tanaka continued. "We didn't come for medals or speeches or whatever this ceremony is supposed to be. And I need you to understand that before we go any further." Thiessen lowered his arms slowly, uncertain how to proceed. "Then why did you come?" "Yes." Colonel Tanaka looked out at the crowd of Corvani, who watched her with a mixture of gratitude and growing unease. 40 years ago, when humanity first reached out to the stars, your council spent 6 months debating whether to destroy us, she said. 17 species voted for what you politely called preemptive neutralization, which meant killing every man, woman, and child on Earth before we could become a threat. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Those votes failed by a margin of 3. Tanaka continued. And instead you chose to quarantine us, to place warning beacons around our space, to restrict our travel, to monitor our colonies, to treat us like dangerous animals that might need to be put down someday. She paused, letting the silence stretch and then the swarm came. And suddenly you needed those dangerous animals. So you sent a message begging for help. And you know what we did? No one answered. We came anyway, Tanaka said. We came because 3 billion people were going to die. And it doesn't matter if those people spent decades looking down on us. It doesn't matter if their leaders voted to exterminate our species. Because we don't let people die when we can save them. That's not who we are. High Arbiter Thiessen found his voice at last. We were wrong, he said. And the words cost him more than he could express. We were wrong about humanity. And I apologize on behalf of the hegemony for the way we have treated your species. I don't want your apology, Tanaka replied. I want you to understand something, and I want everyone watching this to understand it too. She stepped closer to Thiessen, and despite her small size, she suddenly seemed to tower over him. We are not your enemies, she said. We are not your weapons to unleash when diplomacy fails. We are not your monsters to point at threats and then lock back in a cage when the danger is over. We are human, and that means we will help anyone who asks. We will defend anyone who cannot defend themselves. And we will absolutely, without hesitation, destroy anything that threatens the people under our protection. She turned to look at the crowd. At the cameras that broadcast this moment to every world in the hegemony. The swarm is broken, but not dead, she continued. Their collective consciousness will recover in a few centuries. Maybe sooner, and when they do, they will remember this system. They will remember the species who called for human aid. And they will remember what happened when they answered that call. Tanaka allowed herself a small smile. Cold and sharp as a blade, they will never come back, she said. Not here, not anywhere they might encounter humanity. Because we showed them something they had never seen before. We showed them a species that does not just survive. We showed them a species that wins. She turned back to Thiessen. Keep your medals and your speeches, she said. We don't need them. What we need is for you to remember this day. Remember what you saw. Remember what we did. And remember that we did it because it was right. Not because you asked, not because you deserved it, but because that is what humans do. Colonel Tanaka walked back toward her dropship, and her soldiers fell in behind her. She paused the door and looked back one final time. One more thing, she said. Take down the warning beacons around our space. Remove the restrictions on human travel. Stop treating us like animals in a cage. Because we were never in that cage for your protection. Her eyes hardened. You were. The dropship rose into the sky and disappeared into the clouds, leaving behind a stunned silence that spread across the entire plaza within a week. The Galactic Council had voted unanimously to remove all restrictions on human expansion. The warning beacons were dismantled, the quarantine zones were abolished, and a new saying spread across the galaxy. Whispered in the halls of power and in the common places where ordinary beings gathered, do not make enemies of the humans. Not because they will defeat you, but because they will enjoy it. High Arbiter Thiessen stood on his balcony that night, looking up at the stars that humans now moved among freely, and he thought about everything he had witnessed. He thought about the black ships that had appeared from nowhere and destroyed an enemy that should have been invincible. He thought about soldiers who laughed while fighting horrors that had made other species go mad. He thought about a small woman who had refused gratitude and demanded respect instead, and he understood, finally, what humanity truly was. They were not the monsters the hegemony had feared for 40 years. They were something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more necessary. They were the species that looked into the void and made the void blink first. They were the ones who would stand between the darkness and the light. Not because they were asked, but because they chose to. They were human, and the galaxy would never forget what that meant in the cold silence of deep space. 12 black ships returned to their hidden base, their crews already preparing for the next call, the next battle. The next chance to remind the universe that humanity had clawed its way out of the mud, survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear fire, and emerged not peaceful, not enlightened, but unbroken and unafraid. They were ready. They would always be ready, and somewhere in the darkness, the swarm remembered what it had learned and trembled.